Anyone who's ever sat down to read an academic book or journal article, whether as part of a course of study or simply out of interest, will likely have come across a similar problem. Academic writing can be pretty confusing. Whether discussing politics, philosophy, geography, sociology, or whatever else, academics often resort to using sentences that are long and unwieldy, and specialist terminology that anyone who isn't already highly knowledgeable in the topic being discussed will sometimes struggle to understand. Although one would assume that anyone who slaves away for months over a journal article, or years even over an academic book, would want to enthuse the reader to engage with their ideas, the style of academic texts can often lead to them being a little bit off-putting. Those of you who are regular viewers will know that the core of my channel is a series called What the Theory, in which I do my best to break down some key concepts in cultural theory and the wider humanities. In most episodes, I'll take an idea that I think is interesting, but perhaps not widely understood, and try to present it in a format and in language that I think is accessible to as broad an audience as possible. The response to these videos in the few years that I've been making them suggests that many people have found this at least mildly useful. Yet, to some, it perhaps seems bizarre that such a thing should need to exist. Surely whoever conceived of these ideas in the first place should have explained them in a manner that doesn't require those seeking to comprehend them to have to seek out an explanation of that explanation. In today's video then, I want to explore why a lot of academic writing presents in this way. Why do academics, who have all been deemed by at least someone, somewhere to be esteemed, groundbreaking thinkers, often communicate their discoveries about the world in an, initially at least, confusing manner? And is this failure to articulate new ideas in a manner accessible to the general public a, for want of a better word, bad thing? Before we go any further, a quick reminder that if you're new around here and this seems like your kind of thing, you can subscribe and hit the notification bell to get a little buzz whenever I put out a new video. And if you really like what I do here, then you can get early access and copies of the scripts to my videos by supporting the channel at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. With that out of the way, however, let's crack on with the video. The debate over the often opaque style dominant in academic writing is one that has been raging for a number of decades now. In 2014, the psychologist and linguist Steven Pinker caused something of a stir when he wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education, declaring a great deal of academic writing to be turgid, soggy, wooden, bloated, clumsy, obscure, unpleasant to read, and impossible to understand. He gave a number of reasons for this being the case, the most controversial being that bad writing is a deliberate choice. Scholars in the softer fields spout obscure verbiage to hide the fact that they have nothing to say. They dress up the trivial and obvious with the trappings of scientific sophistication, hoping to bamboozle their audiences with highfalutin gobbledygook. Of course, it's not the case that all academics write in such a way. One can find numerous examples of academic text which are, in fact, eminently readable. In the past few years, for instance, the work of the British cultural theorist and philosopher Mark Fisher, in particular his 2009 book Capitalist Realism, has gained popularity far beyond the hallowed halls of academia. Then one has to assume that this is at least partly due to the manner in which Fisher paired his incisive insights into contemporary life and society with a gripping writing style, which draws the reader in and continually inspires them to read on. Yet, I don't think it completely unfair to argue that such work is an exception. And in a manner that gives some credence to Pinker's argument about academics simply wanting to impress their peers, it does often seem that it is some of the most difficult texts which are held in the highest esteem. From 1995 to 1998, the conservative academic journal Philosophy and Literature ran an annual competition called the Bad Writing Contest. The contest was driven by the journal's editor, Dennis Dutton's, desire to find out just how low the state of academic writing had sunk. The rules were simple, he later wrote in an article for the Wall Street Journal. Entries should be a sentence or two from an actual published scholarly book or journal article, no translations into English allowed, and the entries had to be non-ironic. The contest was won by a number of scholars over the years, each of whom were leaders in their respective fields. In its final year, it was awarded to the gender theorist Judith Butler for the following sentence from her article, Further Reflections on the Conversations of Our Time. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure, and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power. Now, unless you yourself are a professor of philosophy, you're probably thinking, wow, that is a hell of a sentence. Not only is it long, but it is littered with highly technical language. In a blog post on his personal website, the writing tutor Charles Euchner later wrote what he describes as a translation of Butler's award-winning sentence, which reads as follows. Structuralists say capitalism operates as a powerful, top-down system, making businesses, schools, and other institutions look and operate the same way. We now think of power as a series of smaller, decentralized interactions. Power does not come from some big force, but from countless interactions throughout society. There are still a few terms in here which require a bit of pre-existing knowledge. One has to know what structuralism is, and perhaps needs some understanding of exactly what is referred to by the term power. Nevertheless, this translation is certainly a great deal easier to understand than the original. If it's possible for Euchner to translate such sentences in this way, and indeed if it's possible for those who make videos in a similar genre to my What the Theory series to explain the work of philosophers like Butler in a way that is arguably a touch more communicative, then why don't academics simply write in this way in the first place? What leads them to lay out their ideas in such a complex and challenging way? Well, contributing to an article in The Atlantic on the needless complexity of academic writing, Deborah S. Bosley, who runs a consultancy firm called the Plain Language Group, writes that academics in general don't think about the public. They don't think about the average person, and they don't even think about their students when they write. Their intended audience is always their peers. That's who they have to impress to get tenure. Bosley's acknowledgement that academics' tendency to write for their peers rather than for the general public is something that is encouraged and in many ways enforced by the system in which they work is important. Having an abundance of articles published in academic journals and books published by academic publishers such as Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan, etc. is essential for anyone seeking to secure a sustainable career in academia. Academics in the UK, furthermore, are required to submit their work every few years to something called the Research Excellence Framework, where it is subjected to the scrutiny of their peers once more. And this process generally values scholarship that is produced for an audience of other academics, and often seems outright sceptical of that written for public consumption. Mark Fisher's Capitalism Real, for instance, despite the influence it's had, was marked low on the ref, in part due to the fact that it was published by a publisher more geared towards the general public. Now, many academics hold the Research Excellence Framework in a pretty low regard, seeing it as an attempt to subject intellectual thought to a quantifiable measurement of quality. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that they're all straining to write more popular work. And though the notion that academics are often writing solely for an audience of their peers is often levelled as an attack on academia, I don't think this always has to be the case. For though some will perhaps be cynical about even this, most academics hold their positions due to them being experts in their field. And if we want them to fulfill their supposed societal function of making new discoveries about the world, then it's necessary for them to sometimes communicate with one another, and in a manner that will perhaps be incomprehensible to those with less knowledge about whatever the topic is in question. I think it's useful here to return to Steven Pinker's critique of academic writing to draw out a hidden specificity of his criticisms. For though in some regards discussing academic writing fairly broadly, a number of times in that article he is more targeted. It is not academics en masse that he accuses of spouting obscure verbiage to hide the fact that they have nothing to say, but specifically those in what he calls the softer fields. Essentially here he means the humanities, in particular fields such as cultural studies, literary studies, and perhaps certain elements of philosophy. In my experience, Pinker is not alone at focusing his critique of academic writing on such fields. Though, as Gordon Rugg has written in an article for The Conversation, scientific writing can be equally as dull to engage with as that in the humanities, it generally comes under far less scrutiny of this kind. Particularly when it comes to the use of opaque or specialist terminology, generally we are far more understanding of the need of scientists to write for each other in ways that those of us without scientific training would struggle to understand. We recognise that atmospheric physicists, say, need to use terms like mesosphere, stratosphere and troposphere to describe specific parts of what most of us would generally simply refer to as the atmosphere. I don't want to dig too deeply into why many people don't view academic writing in the humanities in the same way here. What I do want to point to, however, is the inconsistency of this view. For is it not just as important for those who seek to understand how society works to be able to have higher level conversations with one another? Is Judith Butler's use of the term hegemony, for instance, less an attempt to willfully make her ideas sound more insightful than they truly are, and more the result of her writing for an audience of her peers, and thus using technical language in order to have the kind of higher level conversations with those peers necessary to further our understanding of the world? Let's continue on with this example of the term hegemony. In the context in which Butler uses it, hegemony refers to the manner in which political and economic elites, having control over the media and culture industry, enables them to propagate an understanding of the world which presents their wealth and power as logical and morally just, which by extension enables them to further increase their economic and political power within society. There's not really another term in the English language which describes this process in quite the same way. Its use is specialised, and moreover, it has been developed over time through countless prior academic articles and books. When discussing such processes with non-academics, then yes, it's important to clarify what's meant by the term. Yet, when writing for an audience of other academics, it would be just as ridiculous for Butler, say, to have to explain what was meant by the term hegemony every time it is used, as it would be for atmospheric physicists to have to begin every article about the mesosphere with an explanation as to what exactly that term refers to. Indeed, Judith Butler has responded a number of times to criticisms of her own personal writing style. In the introduction to the 1999 edition of her seminal book Gender Trouble, Butler writes that both critics and friends of Gender Trouble have drawn attention to the difficulty of its style. It is no doubt strange and maddening to some to find a book that is not easily consumed to be popular according to academic standards. As I've discussed, although it now might have become so well known in certain circles to have been featured in Netflix's BoJack Horseman, one of the reasons that the style of Gender Trouble can be off-putting to some is simply due to the fact that Butler did not write the book for a general audience. While I highly doubt she was displeased that it gained popularity among the general public, it was conceived of primarily with Butler's peers, who would recognise the influence of the post-structuralist style of both thinking and writing which dominates the book in mind. Butler continues, however, by asking us to comprehend the political aspect of this debate surrounding academic writing styles. She reflects that, "I think that style is a complicated terrain. and not one that we unilaterally choose or control with the purposes we consciously intend. Certainly, one can practice styles, but the styles that become available to you are not entirely a matter of choice. Moreover, neither grammar nor style are politically neutral. Learning the rules that govern intelligible speech is an inculcation into normalized language. It would be a mistake to think that received grammar is the best vehicle for expressing radical views, given the constraints that grammar imposes upon thought, indeed upon the thinkable itself. Butler's point here is that the style in which one writes and the words that one has at their disposal affect what one can and can't say, and what one can and can't think. To only use everyday language in academic writing, she contends, would be to constrain academics to the dominant thinking of society at a given moment in time. Academic writing in the humanities, as Butler sees it, is often complex because the use of new and initially obscure terminology that most people wouldn't be familiar with is necessary to express new things about the world around us. To return to Steven Pinker, it is worth noting that one of his most widely read books, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is essentially a defense of contemporary capitalist society. Pinker writes in his preface that a large swathe of our intellectual culture is loath to admit that there could be anything good about civilization, modernity, and Western society, before proceeding to argue that the world has been gradually become less violent over time, and that for that we should be thankful. The book itself has been heavily critiqued for the way that it extrapolates its argument from the historical data, and I think Pinker's suggestion that critiquing contemporary society is necessarily to argue that history has been a process of things getting worse to be simplistic in the extreme. What's important for our discussion here, however, is that Pinker is seeking to defend society as it exists in the present day. And if one's goal is simply to uphold the values and received wisdom of society as it exists, then perhaps one has no need for complex terms. The language in widespread circulation allows one to pretty easily talk up the benefits of capitalism and liberal democracy. If one seeks to critique that same society, however, one often finds the need to use new and potentially more complex language. As Judith Butler argued then, critiquing the world as it exists using pre-existing language sometimes simply isn't possible. It takes the development of terms such as hegemony to articulate some of the more nefarious processes at work in contemporary society. Does this mean that such academic writing is harder to understand? Yes. But that is because the ideas that are being expressed are ones which actively challenge the understanding of the world that we have been given. Complex thoughts require complex language. And if we were to mandate that academic writing use only everyday language, then we would be mandating it to only ever express ideas already dominant in society. Can academic books and journal articles be tough to understand then? Yes. And could some perhaps be written in a manner that is more accessible? Yeah, that's probably true too. I regularly struggle with complex text and don't think there's any shame in that, or needing to turn to additional resources in order to help you get through. Yet, I think it's worth realising that the reason that we turn to scholarly writing is usually because we want to expand our understanding of the world. And in doing so, I think we have to be prepared that sometimes that might be a challenge. Society functions in complex ways, and describing it thus often calls for complex language. Furthermore, if we want academic texts to allow us to see the world in new ways, we have to be prepared that being able to do so might require us to learn new terminology to describe it. Thank you very much for watching this video. Do let me know what your take on all of this is below. Thanks as ever to Ash, to Michael V. Brown, to J. Fraser Cartwright, to Sindri Nielsen, to Army of Me, and to Kaya Lau for being signed up to the top tier of my Patreon page. If you'd like to join them in supporting what I do here, then you can sign up to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thanks for watching once again, and have a great week.